The history of Canada, a nation of nearly 10 million square kilometers, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and northward to the Arctic Ocean. A land of remarkable contrasts, from dense boreal forests to windswept tundras, from cosmopolitan cities to isolated frontier settlements. Yet beneath the carefully constructed narrative of peaceful development and orderly progress lies a far more complex and often troubling story, one marked by violence, dispossession, and the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths. So what really happened in the formation of this nation? Who truly benefited from its development? And perhaps most importantly, what records have vanished from the historical archive? This is the Untold History of Canada, a story of power, profit, and the selective preservation of memory. The conventional narrative begins with the arrival of the First Nations peoples across the Bering Land Bridge some 16,000 years ago, spreading southward as the ice sheets retreated. Over millennia, these populations developed sophisticated societies with complex social structures, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural traditions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for instance, established a democratic system of governance that would later influence European political thought. The Pacific Northwest peoples built elaborate permanent settlements and developed advanced resource management practices. The Plains nations followed intricate seasonal migration patterns in harmony with bison herds. Yet this flourishing of indigenous civilization is often reduced to a brief preface in standard histories, a prologue before the real story of European arrival begins. This framing itself represents a choice about whose history matters, whose achievements deserve recognition, and whose perspective defines the national narrative. The Norse arrival around the year 1000 is typically presented as a curious historical footnote, a failed experiment that left no lasting impact. Yet recent archaeological evidence suggests a more extensive Norse presence than previously acknowledged. Beyond Lance Awe Meadows in Newfoundland, potential Norse artifacts have been discovered at sites across the Canadian Arctic and even into the interior. Some researchers argue that Norse traders may have maintained sporadic contact with indigenous peoples for decades or even centuries, introducing European diseases and trade goods long before the official age of exploration. If true, this would fundamentally alter our understanding of pre-Columbian North America. But these theories remain controversial, partly because they challenge established historical timelines, and partly because the evidence is fragmentary. One must ask whether the scarcity of evidence reflects historical reality or merely the limitations of what has been preserved and what has been sought. The age of European exploration and colonization beginning in the late 15th century is where the official Canadian narrative truly begins. John Cabot's 1497 voyage is celebrated as the rediscovery of North America by Europeans. What receives less attention is the immediate economic motivation behind these expeditions. The search for the Northwest Passage to Asia and the exploitation of fishing grounds off the Grand Banks drove European interest in the region. These were not voyages of enlightenment or discovery in any noble sense, but rather reconnaissance missions for commercial exploitation. The indigenous peoples encountered were viewed primarily as obstacles, potential trading partners, or labor sources, not as sovereign nations with legitimate claims to the territory they had occupied for thousands of years. Jacques Cartier's expeditions in the 1530s and 1540s established French claims to the St. Lawrence region. The standard histories emphasize his exploration and mapping efforts, his naming of Canada, and his attempts at settlement. What they often minimize is the violence and kidnapping that characterized these encounters. Cartier abducted several indigenous people, including Chief Donnacona, taking them to France where most died. He also engaged in armed confrontations with local populations. These actions set a pattern that would repeat throughout Canadian history, where European territorial ambitions trumped indigenous rights and lives. The early French settlements that followed were precarious ventures, dependent on indigenous knowledge and assistance for survival, yet simultaneously working to undermine indigenous autonomy and appropriate their lands. The establishment of New France in the early 17th century is often portrayed as a relatively peaceful process of gradual settlement and development. Samuel de Champlain is lionized as the founder of Quebec and a skilled diplomat who forged alliances with indigenous nations. This is partially true, but it obscures the strategic calculations behind these alliances. Champlain allied with the Huron, Algonquin, and Montagnais peoples primarily to gain advantage in the fur trade and to counter the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south. These alliances drew indigenous nations into European conflicts and disrupted existing political relationships. The fur trade itself, while economically beneficial to some indigenous traders, created dependencies, intensified intertribal warfare over hunting territories, and introduced devastating diseases that decimated populations. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases killed an estimated 90% of indigenous peoples in some regions. This was not an unfortunate side effect, but rather a catastrophic consequence that fundamentally altered the balance of power, making European colonization possible. The rivalry between New France and British North America during the 17th and 18th centuries is typically framed as a struggle between two European powers for continental dominance. The indigenous peoples are cast as supporting players, allies of one side or the other, rather than as independent actors pursuing their own interests. In reality, indigenous nations engaged in sophisticated diplomatic strategies, playing European powers against each other to maintain their own autonomy and territorial control. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, resulted in the British conquest of New France in 1763. This transfer of powers presented as a relatively orderly transition, with the British magnanimously allowing French Canadians to retain their language, religion, and legal traditions through the Quebec Act of 1774. What this narrative omits is the brutal expulsion of the Acadian population from Nova Scotia between 1755 and 1764. Approximately 11,000 Acadians were forcibly removed from their lands, their homes burned, their communities destroyed. Thousands died during the deportation or in exile. This ethnic cleansing is sometimes acknowledged, but rarely given the prominence it deserves in the national story. The land seized from the Acadians was redistributed to British settlers, a pattern of dispossession that would be repeated across the continent. The American Revolution and the subsequent migration of Loyalists to Canada is celebrated as a founding moment of English Canada, when principled supporters of the Crown chose loyalty over rebellion. This interpretation serves a useful nationalist purpose, distinguishing Canada from the United States as the more orderly, conservative, and British of the two nations. What it ignores is that many Loyalists were motivated less by principle than by material interests. Large landowners, merchants with British connections, and Crown officials faced the loss of property and position in an independent America. Moreover, among the Loyalists were enslavers who brought enslaved people with them to Canada. Slavery existed in Canada throughout the French and British colonial periods. While it was never as extensive as in the plantation economies to the south, thousands of Indigenous and African people were enslaved in Canada. Slavery was not abolished in Upper Canada until 1793, and even then only gradually, with full abolition across the British Empire, not occurring until 1834. This aspect of Canadian history has been systematically downplayed, allowing Canada to present itself as a terminus of the Underground Railroad and the land of freedom, while conveniently forgetting its own participation in the institution of slavery. The War of 1812 occupies an outsized place in Canadian historical consciousness, celebrated as the moment when Canada successfully defended itself against American aggression and forged a distinct national identity. The burning of York, the defense of Queenston Heights, and the Battle of Lundy's Lane are commemorated as heroic episodes. Less frequently mentioned is the fact that much of the fighting was done by British regular troops rather than Canadian militia, or that Indigenous warriors, particularly the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his confederacy, played crucial roles in the defense of Canada. Tecumseh's death in battle in 1813 marked the end of Indigenous hopes for an independent territory between the United States and Canada. The British, having used Indigenous allies to defend their territory, promptly abandoned them in the peace negotiations. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 made no provisions for Indigenous rights or territories. This betrayal set the stage for the subsequent dispossession of Indigenous peoples across Canada. The rebellions of 1837 in Upper and Lower Canada are typically presented as failed uprisings that nevertheless led to important constitutional reforms and the path toward responsible government. The rebels are portrayed as either misguided radicals or principled reformers, depending on one's perspective. What receives less attention is the brutal suppression of these rebellions. Hundreds were arrested, dozens were executed, and many more were transported to penal colonies in Australia. In Lower Canada, entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were burned by British troops. The Durham Report that followed recommended the assimilation of French Canadians into British culture, describing them as a people without history or culture. Although this particular recommendation was not fully implemented, it revealed the underlying assumptions of British colonial policy, that Indigenous and French cultures were obstacles to progress that needed to be overcome or eliminated. The formation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867 is celebrated as Confederation, a peaceful and democratic union of British colonies into a self-governing nation. The fathers of Confederation are honored as visionary statesmen who built a country through negotiation and compromise. This is true as far as it goes, but it tells only part of the story. Confederation was driven largely by economic interests, particularly the desire to build a transcontinental railway that would open Western lands to settlement and resource extraction. The Indigenous peoples who occupied these Western lands were not consulted about Confederation. Their territories were simply assumed to be available for Canadian expansion. The Hudson's Bay Company, which claimed to own Rupert's Land, an area comprising much of present-day Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of other provinces, sold this vast territory to the new Canadian government in 1809 for $300,000. The company had no legitimate claim to ownership. The land belonged to the Indigenous peoples who lived there, but this was irrelevant to the transaction. The Métis people of the Red River region, led by Louis Riel, resisted this transfer of their homeland. The Red River Rebellion of 1869 to 1870 forced the Canadian government to negotiate and resulted in the creation of Manitoba as a province with protections for Métis land rights and French language rights. However, these protections were systematically undermined in subsequent years, and many Métis were dispossessed of their lands through legal manipulation and bureaucratic obstruction. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway between 1881 and 1885 is presented as a nation-building triumph, the physical linking of the country from sea to sea. The famous photograph of the driving of the last spike at Craigellachie, British Columbia, symbolizes Canadian unity and achievement. What this celebratory narrative omits is the human cost of the railway's construction. Thousands of Chinese laborers were recruited to build the railway through the treacherous terrain of the Rocky Mountains. They were paid less than white workers, given the most dangerous jobs, and hundreds died in accidents or from disease. After the railway's completion, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 imposed the head tax on Chinese immigrants, explicitly designed to prevent further Chinese immigration. This tax was progressively increased until 1923, when Chinese immigration was banned entirely, a ban that remained in place until 1947. The railway also facilitated the rapid settlement of the prairies, which required the removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands. Between 1871 and 1921, the Canadian government negotiated a series of numbered treaties with Indigenous nations across the West and North. These treaties are often portrayed as agreements between sovereign nations, but the reality was far more coercive. Indigenous peoples facing starvation due to the deliberate destruction of bison herds, disease epidemics, and military pressure had little choice but to sign. Moreover, the oral promises made during treaty negotiations often differed significantly from the written terms, which Indigenous leaders could not read. The government systematically violated even the written terms of these treaties, reducing reserve sizes, restricting movement, and failing to provide promised support. Perhaps the darkest chapter in Canadian history, one that has only recently received significant public attention, is the residential school system. Beginning in the 1870s and continuing until the last school closed in 1996, over 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and placed in residential schools. These institutions, run by Christian churches and funded by the government, were explicitly designed to, in the words of One government official, "Kill the Indian in the child." Children were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their cultures, or maintaining contact with their families. They were subjected to harsh discipline, forced labor, inadequate food and medical care, and widespread physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Thousands died from disease, neglect, or abuse and were buried in unmarked graves. The survivors carry lifelong trauma, and the intergenerational effects continue to devastate Indigenous communities today. This was not education, it was cultural genocide, a systematic attempt to destroy Indigenous peoples as distinct nations and assimilate them into Canadian society. For over a century, this system operated with the full knowledge and support of the Canadian government and churches. Yet it was barely mentioned in Canadian history textbooks until the 1980s. And many Canadians remained unaware of it until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report in 2015. The question of what records have vanished is particularly pertinent to the residential school system. Church and government records of the schools are incomplete, with significant gaps and evidence of deliberate destruction. Records of deaths and burials are missing or inadequate. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought access to documents, both churches and the government were often unable or unwilling to provide complete records. This has made it difficult to establish the full extent of deaths and abuses, to identify children who died, and to locate burial sites. The recent discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites across Canada has shocked the nation, but these deaths were not unknown at the time. They were simply not recorded, not investigated, and not remembered. This erasure of evidence is itself a form of historical violence, denying victims recognition and preventing accountability. Throughout the 20th century, Canada cultivated an international image as a peaceful, tolerant, multicultural nation, a peacekeeper, and a defender of human rights. This image has considerable basis in reality. Canada did play important peacekeeping roles, did welcome refugees, and did develop progressive social policies. But this positive narrative has also served to obscure less admirable aspects of Canadian history. During the First World War, Canadians of Ukrainian, German, and Austro-Hungarian descent were subjected to internment, with over 8,000 people imprisoned in camps where they performed forced labor. During the Second World War, approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast, their property confiscated and sold, and they were interned in camps in the interior. This occurred despite the fact that not a single Japanese Canadian was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage. After the war, the government encouraged Japanese Canadians to move east of the Rockies or to repatriate to Japan, and many were deported. It was not until 1988 that the Canadian government formally apologized and provided compensation to survivors. Immigration policy throughout Canadian history has been explicitly racist, designed to maintain Canada as a white, British nation. Beyond the Chinese head tax and exclusion, the Immigration Act of 1910 gave the government power to prohibit entry based on race, nationality, or ethnic group. This was used to restrict or ban immigration from Asia, Africa, and other regions deemed undesirable. Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution in the 1930s and 40s were largely turned away, with Canada accepting fewer Jewish refugees than almost any other Western nation. The most infamous case is that of the MS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees that was denied entry to Canada in 1910 and forced to return to Europe, where many of its passengers subsequently died in the Holocaust. When asked how many Jewish refugees Canada should accept, a senior immigration official replied, "None is too many." Immigration policy only began to liberalize in the 1960s with the introduction of the points system, which theoretically removed racial discrimination, though systemic barriers remained. The beneficiaries of Canadian history are not difficult to identify. European settlers and their descendants gained access to vast territories and resources. Corporations from the Hudson's Bay Company to the Canadian Pacific Railway to modern resource extraction companies have profited enormously from access to land, timber, minerals, fish, and other resources. Political and economic elites have shaped policies to serve their interests. The losers are equally clear. Indigenous peoples who were dispossessed, killed by disease and violence, subjected to cultural genocide and confined to reserves. The Métis who were driven from their lands. Chinese, Japanese, and other racialized immigrants who faced discrimination, exploitation, and exclusion. French Canadians who fought for recognition and rights within Confederation. Working-class Canadians who labored to build the country's infrastructure and economy, while elites reaped the profits. The question of what records have vanished extends beyond residential schools. Many Indigenous oral histories and traditions were lost as languages died and communities were disrupted. Documents related to treaty negotiations, land transactions, and government policies toward Indigenous peoples have gone missing or been destroyed. Corporate records of labor practices, environmental damage, and resource extraction are often unavailable. The historical archive is not a neutral repository of the past, but rather a selective collection shaped by power relations. Those with power determine what is preserved and what is discarded, what is made accessible and what is hidden, what is commemorated and what is forgotten. In recent decades, there has been growing recognition of these historical injustices. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 1990s, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 2010s, and various inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women have documented systemic discrimination and violence. Apologies have been issued, compensation has been paid, and there are ongoing efforts at reconciliation. However, the fundamental structures that produce these injustices, the dispossession of Indigenous lands, the exploitation of resources, the concentration of wealth and power, remain largely intact. Indigenous peoples continue to face poverty, inadequate housing, unsafe drinking water, and discrimination. Resource extraction continues on Indigenous territories without meaningful consent. The gap between Canada's self-image as a progressive, multicultural nation and the reality of ongoing colonialism and inequality remains vast. Understanding what really happened in Canadian history requires looking beyond the official narratives of peaceful development and orderly progress. It requires recognizing that Canada, like all nations, was built through violence, dispossession, and exploitation. It requires acknowledging who benefited and who suffered. And it requires asking what has been erased from the historical record and why. Only by confronting this complex and often troubling history can Canada move toward genuine reconciliation and justice. The history of Canada is not a simple story of triumph, but rather a contested terrain where different peoples with different interests and different memories struggle over the meaning of the past and the shape of the future. This is the real history of Canada, uncomfortable, incomplete, and still being written.